The New York Times is reporting this morning that the Justice Department plans to take on affirmative action in college admissions. According to a document obtained by the Times, the plan is to try to protect white applicants from discrimination. Joining us to discuss is Matt Schlapp. He's the former political director for George W. Bush and current chairman for the American Conservative Union. And Van Jones, he's a CNN political commentator and a former special advisor to President Obama. Gentlemen, great to have both of you. Matt Schlapp, what is wrong with affirmative action?
Nothing's wrong with it. I think it was well intended. The idea is that when you have populations that have faced serious discrimination, the government steps in to make sure that people are not doing things that break the law, that discriminate against people. But
so why now try to change it?
Well, the whole concept is eventually you want these programs to go away. Eventually, we want to realize Dr. King's dream of a colorblind society.
And have we gotten there? Is it time? Do you think that it has outlived now its usefulness?
Well, at the American Conservative Union, we have this project called the Family Prosperity Index. And what you're seeing in politics and what you're seeing in culture is there's actually tremendous hardship that is really wreaking havoc on rural white America. Opioid addiction, suicides are going through the roof. So at some point in all of these programs, especially in these college admissions, Allison, you're saying to one person, we're going to give you a leg up, we're going to give you the slot, but inevitably, in every case, you're actually taking slots away as well. And as a country, we have to ask ourselves, at what point do we have the right standards in these programs?
Van, your response.
Well, I think that we're seeing now a pretty disturbing pattern with Jeff Sessions and with the Department of Justice. We really should be trying to, especially for, we'll get to the white community, which needs a lot of help as well, especially rural, we agree on that. But you've got some communities that you really need to be trying to open doors of opportunity and close prison doors. Sessions seems to be going in the opposite direction. He seems to be wanting to double down on the failed drug war, which is going to have more young urban youth going to prison, and then ratchet back on the scholarships and the support to get them to college. You put that together, and you've got a Justice Department that seems to have a very negative and disturbing view of the future for young African Americans, for young Latinos and others. The other thing is, when you look at the total approach, you also want more people voting and you want better policing. He seems to be wanting to take a step back on the policing standards and yet not be helping on the voting standards. So you have a whole, it's a pattern here that's very, very
negative. I understand, and so you're looking at the big picture and the pattern. But on affirmative action specifically, what about Matt's point, the conservative viewpoint, that poor whites are struggling also, and if in college admissions you always favor black or Latino applicants, that it's now no longer the goal of a level playing field isn't working exactly?
Well, the numbers don't bear out the concern yet. You have to admit, at some point, you could get to a point where you're overcompensating. But if you look at the numbers, they don't bear that out. But let's not conflate apples and oranges here. Matt is 100% correct. When you're talking about rural poverty, what's going on in small-town America, we have not done enough. Democrats or Republicans have not done enough to respond to those crises. But I think it's a mistake. Rather than turning on each other, we should turn to each other. We need to be doing a lot better by all kids, especially low-income kids. But poverty is not the same as racial discrimination. You got to be able to deal with both.
Can I do something very dangerous? Can I also agree with Van? That I also think that our prison system and our incarceration system should be focused on violent criminals. I do fear that we have this lock 'em up mentality. We put people in prison who we don't like instead of who we fear. And I want to focus on violent criminals. So I do think Van has a good point there. I think that when it comes to all these questions, we have to have a fair understanding that when you hurt one American to help another American, and you do it for all these reasons in employment or specifically at colleges, we have to see what the implications are for the person who was left behind. And I just think in 21st century America, with all of our problems, and our problems are on our television sets all day long, but at some point we have to say, don't we all have a fair shake? Haven't we done a good job for half a century to try to change our laws to make sure that we are colorblind and that everybody has...
It just depends on if you think that we're done with that work. If you think it's now a level playing field.
I would say no. I don't think it's a level play. I don't think we ever get to perfection or nirvana in this world.
So then,
but I think it gets better.
Students still need some help.
I think it gets better. I think your standards need to lower. So I think what you have to do with the judicial standards to determine.
I disagree with a couple things here, though.
Well, let me just say, I'll quickly summarize.
Yeah.
There are legal standards on whether or not you can have these programs and when these programs have done what they needed to do. And I actually think the scrutiny standards need to be raised so that you only have these programs when you can see real racial. You're not having racial discrimination at Harvard, at Yale, at Princeton, at Berkeley. It's absurd.
Okay, Van.
Well, on this point, I see it differently. First of all, the Supreme Court has already ratcheted the standards up pretty high. They just revisited this issue a little while ago, and basically what you've got to be able to show is a whole number of things. You've got to be able to show that there's a pattern of discrimination, not just at that institution, but that's important. It also turns out that our Supreme Court says that colleges do have an interest in making sure that the student body is diverse. It can't be overdone, but that is a problem. If you could come up with a situation where if you have the wrong set of standards, the entire student body could look exactly one way.
Yeah, but hold on one second. But bottom line, Van, are you comfortable that the Justice Department is going to look into whether it's time to rework affirmative action?
No, because we just went through this with the Supreme Court, and if the Justice Department wants to lean forward and try to deal with racial discrimination, you still have states in this country that are blocking people from voting aggressively, according to the Supreme Court. You still have police departments that are discriminating. You still have real serious barriers. They're backing away from that, and they're focusing on this. I think it's a complete misallocation of resources.
Okay, we have to leave it there.
Sorry.
You got the first word. Thanks, Matt.
I'll come back and get the last word.
Please do. Thank you very much, Van. Matt, thank you very much. Chris.
All right, tough story. Routine traffic stop turns into an incredibly dangerous situation. You watch on your screen? How did this officer get himself to safety? Look at...
Presidents demand that the Senate change their rules to pass bills by a simple majority.
There are not the votes in the Senate, as I've said repeatedly to the President and to all of you, to change the rules of the Senate.
It comes as the Senate Health Committee's influential Republican chairman also pushes back against the president's threat to let Obamacare implode by stopping payments to insurance companies. Senator Lamar Alexander proposing bipartisan legislation that would do exactly the opposite.
Our proposal is that by mid-September, we will see if we can agree on a way to stabilize the individual insurance market.
Senate Republicans also criticizing the administration's shifting story about the president's role in crafting his son's misleading initial statement about the reason for the June 2016 meeting with a Russian lawyer.
When you put out a misleading statement, it's going to be hard to convince people to stop looking at other things.
The White House admitting Tuesday that the president was involved.
The president weighed in as any father would based on the limited information that he had.
Contradicting repeated denials from the president's legal team.
The president was not involved in the drafting of the statement. I wasn't involved in the statement drafting at all, nor was the president. The president didn't sign off on anything.
Sarah Sanders denying reports that President Trump personally dictated the deceptive statement and attempting to shift the narrative.
Everybody wants to try to make this some story about misleading. The only thing I see misleading is a year's worth of stories that have been fueling a false narrative about this Russia collusion.
The ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee investigating possible collusion disagreeing.
This administration continues to say, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, there's nothing there. Yet they don't act that way at all.
The administration continues to try to shore up its base on the right. The New York Times is reporting this morning that the administration is looking at suing universities for affirmative action policies that may discriminate against white students. There are also proposals for a new trade policy, a new trade case against China, as well as introduction of legislation that would essentially introduce a skill-based immigration policy in the United States. Chris and Allison, back to you.
Okay, Joe, thank you very much for all of that. Let's bring in our political panel. We have CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large, Chris Cillizza. CNN political analyst, David Gregory and Avalon. David, I don't know what we're doing, David Gregory. Is it your sense that Republicans, leading Republicans in the Senate, have reached some sort of tipping point where even beyond Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Jeff Flake, that they are now more willing to come out and publicly split with the president?
Well, more clearly they are. There's no question about it, because I think they feel emboldened to take on a president who's increasingly weak, although he still has his base behind him of Republicans who put him into office. But this is a president who continues to provoke them and to challenge them from the outside, as if he's not the head of the Republican Party. And he's a president who's not leveling with the American people. The White House lies about things it should not lie about. This Russia investigation is something that grows bigger because of how the president and his team handles it. Period. You want to wiggle out from that? Then level with the American people. It's that simple. And Republicans on Capitol Hill are increasingly paying the penalty for that, as they have a president who lacks credibility. If you don't tell the truth about some things, you can't be believed on other things. And the president's credibility, the White House's credibility has suffered, and makes it very difficult for him then to influence Republicans to do what he says they ought to do. The party is increasingly moving away from him, moving away from this White House as it tries to chart its own future and face voters on its own.
John Avlon, Tim Scott in the Washington Post. Quote, "We work for the American people. We do not work for the president. We should do what's good for the administration, as long as that does not in any way, shape, or form make it harder on the American people." There had been this patience or impatience for a tipping point. When will these people in the GOP take back their own party? When will they own their own mandate? Last night, I heard one of the conservatives say, it's not just about the base. It's about the fact that the president is being base. And, we have to stand against that. We're real conservatives. How real do you think this is?
I think it's real, and it's gonna become more defined, and here's why. First of all, as you look at the president's approval numbers, it's not just that he has the lowest approval rating in history, recorded history among the American public. Yes, he's strong among the base, but that's weakening. More importantly, most Republican senators who ran in 2016 ran ahead of Donald Trump. He had reverse coattails. He didn't bring them over the finish line. They ran ahead of him. So they've got a mandate from their voters that should inspire them to straighten their civic backbone a bit and to start reasserting basic separation of powers. The other factor, of course, is that people are getting exhausted from defending the indefensible or having positions they're being told to take out undercut by the president's actions or statements on any given day. So if that all of a sudden gets people to start thinking about the national interest as opposed to special interests, if that starts getting people to think about strengthening separation of powers for the good of the republic, that's a good thing.
And Crystal, they're not just thinking about it and talking about it, they're actually doing things. I mean, you can see actual policy. Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee is working in a bipartisan way with Patty Murray of Washington to strengthen and stabilize Obamacare, not to repeal or replace, as the president has wanted. They are beginning to take actual policy actions that seem to be at odds with what the president has said he wants.
Oh, not seem to be, Allison. I think are directly at odds. I mean, Donald Trump's solution in the wake of the failure of the Senate to pass a health care bill is essentially let's let this fail. Let's let the Obamacare collapse under its own weight, and then everyone will come begging to us for a solution, and Democrats will get blamed. He literally has said basically that. I think what you see in Lamar Alexander is a guy, let's not forget, this is a guy with a pretty storied political career. He's run for president twice. He was in the leadership in the Senate. He took a step back from that. But this is someone who's fundamentally sort of a problem solver, someone who's been in public service for a very long time, and someone who is not going to follow the president's lead and just let people in his state of Tennessee or in any state watch as this thing totally collapses. So I think the fear factor, to the extent it ever existed with Donald Trump, is essentially gone. That yes, they know he will take shots at them. Yes, they know he may attack them by name, but no, they are no longer as afraid of him as they might have been earlier. And never forget this. The Lamar Alexanders of the world were never Donald Trump allies. They voted for him probably because they preferred him to Hillary Clinton. These are never people that are going to be deeply loyal to him. So it doesn't take a lot to peel them away. And I think he's given them more than enough over these 6 months to convince them that staying with him at all times on all things is politically perilous.
All right, so let's talk about, David, the different irons that are in the fire here. Okay, so we have this dynamic about, let's call it the enough is enough, maybe.
Sure, I like it.
You have the president's reaction to it, which is to do what he does best. You give him opposition, he attacks you. The president over the weekend tweeting Republicans in the Senate will never win if they don't go to a 51 majority vote now. This is taking care of the filibuster rule once and for all. They look like fools and are just wasting time. So he provoked them. They now seem to be responding by that to say, no, we're going to do our business. And remember why it matters, David. Set this up for us. September. You have September morn coming there. You have the debt ceiling. You have the the ability to get a budget done. Those are both in September. September morn, Neil Diamond.
I got it.
So how big is that?
I think it's really important. You also have tax reform. Now, this is something that you saw Democrats say, oh, we'll get involved in this. Let's try to craft something bigger with our priorities as well, forcing Majority Leader McConnell to say, no, they're out of sync with Republican priorities. We'll probably have to do this with reconciliation, just 51 votes. But the president provokes the Republicans. You have the leader of the Republicans, McConnell, reminding the White House, hey, we didn't have the votes on health care, period. So it doesn't matter whether we just had to reach that 50-vote threshold. We didn't have it. And the president knows this or should know it, but still wants to cast himself as being outside the Republican Party. And I think it's interesting if you look at Arizona alone. Look, John McCain, who has now returned to his maverick self, with this horrible cancer diagnosis that he's received and the role he played on health care, well, he had to get closer to Trump to win re-election, but now has become more independent. And here's Jeff Flake, the junior senator, a real conservative out of Arizona, who knows that Trump is going to support a primary opponent to him. He comes out with this book kind of reasserting conservatism against Donald Trump. I think this is significant on all these fights you're talking about, from taxes to raising the debt ceiling, ultimately on the budget, that there's a kind of conservative backlash going on now against Trump that we haven't seen really since the campaign.
Quickly wrap this up.
Look, it's about damn time, and here's why. Senators historically have been the place that cooled the civic debate, that thought about the national interest, that tried to take into account as bipartisan coalitions whenever possible. The fact that that's been degraded in recent decades by an increasing ideological polarization of the party, that's helped lead to Donald Trump. But if this is what's required, the constant insults from the Oval Office is what's required to have senators start restoring their best selves, their best traditions, good. Let's have it happen again and help us all.
September morn, we dance the dance into a brand new day. Nothing.
Nothing. Green Day.
Nothing.
Day.
Go on.
I thought she was going to pick up on that in a second.
What about
I need the music in order to hum a few bars of that.
Neil Diamond?
Oh, I know.
That's us.
I know it's Neil Diamond.
Not Jersey, but still.
No, it's not Jersey.
All right, the White House finally conceding that President Trump did weigh in on his son's misleading statement about that meeting with a Russian lawyer. Oh, who cares? They said he had nothing to do with it. That's what his lawyers said. Why do they keep changing the story? Next, we dance the dance into a fray. On Don Jr.'s meeting with Russians at Trump Tower. Now they're changing their story. Let's bring back the panel. Chris Cillizza, David Gregory, John Avlon. Relevance.
I mean, look, Sarah Huckabee Sanders is trying to build back a credibility gap, and she undermined it dramatically yesterday. First of all, we know Don Jr.'s statement that they put out was fundamentally false, right? We know that. We also know the spin around it, and the fact that the president apparently dictated it was contradicted by Jay Sekulow, the president's lawyer, on CNN and other outlets. So there's really no place to go. So instead, they're trying to call anyone who's asking questions a Russophobe. But that was a low. That did not comport with reality, and they knew it.
Chris Cillizza, here are the repercussions. I mean, according to Senator Lindsey Graham, why this matters. Listen to this.
One, he put his son in jeopardy. Now we have to wonder about what Don Jr.'s team will tell you about what he actually did. If you didn't know about the email, the statement may have fooled you. If you know about the email with Don Jr., then it's a misleading statement.
So you just don't know what to trust is part of the problem.
the issue here, well, I mean, there are a lot of issues. John touched on one, which is just fundamentally, Sarah Huckabee Sanders said yesterday, is a direct contradiction to what the White House has been saying. Number two, remember that the Trump White House, Jay Sekulow, Donald Trump, has essentially said, look, I didn't know anything about this. You know, I was sort of clueless about this meeting. I wasn't there. I didn't know anything about it. They've now said he weighed in. Now, that's a tough term to figure out. I don't know what does weighed in mean. Does it mean he looked at it? Does it mean he edited it? Does it mean he dictated it, as the Washington Post reported? But regardless, he had a hand in that statement. We now know that. That statement was very carefully crafted in that there's nothing, if you look at it, there is nothing that is factually definitely wrong. It was primarily about Russian adoptions. We don't have evidence to suggest that if it was 20 minutes, 11 of the minutes were about Russian adoptions. Okay. It was not a campaign issue. That's true. Russian adoptions weren't a campaign issue. What's left out of it, though, is massive about, why did the meeting take place? Yeah. Who was going to be there? So if Donald Trump really knew limited information, according to Sarah Huckabee Sanders, that's a pretty carefully worded statement for someone who doesn't know much about it. That's what really sort of got my siren up. Like it is not a statement you would make if somebody said, yeah, we had this meeting. It's a statement you would make that would suggest you knew that there was things you weren't saying and you were carefully using terms to keep yourself out of any factual jeopardy there.
I think Allison is spot on about this, David, in that, people rush to illegality or to impeachment. And it's a mistake because they're very high bars. Yes. But trust is a main measure that seems to be failing in this situation. John Dean and Robert Ray, so the Whitewater Council and the famous Watergate counselor, both agreed that what seems to be going on here is a question of trust on both sides. That the president doesn't trust the people around him to support his innocence, that he has done nothing wrong. He has nothing to conceal, and therefore it is okay for him to disrupt the narrative that's out there that suggests anything different. And as a result, they twist the truth, they misinterpret or misstate at a minimum, and that then hurts the trust of the media and those outside their own little circle to trust anything they say. Fair appraisal?
Yeah, I think that's really it, because the original premise is that this is ridiculous. This investigation is ridiculous. As Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, it's being overblown and there's anonymous sources. It's okay to lie. It's okay to mislead. It's okay to misinterpret. And I'm sorry, we can parse this in our remaining time here on television. They don't deserve the benefit of the doubt. This was the same team and the same president who brought us the birther lie to launch himself into national politics. So he weighed in as any father would on behalf of his president. Number one, this is why you don't have kids involved in your campaigns or working for you, because it's a conflict of interest. That's number one. Number two, no, sorry, doesn't pass any kind of rational test. You think Donald Trump was not actively involved? He didn't just weigh in. He dictated the statement, and his lawyer said he didn't. That was not the truth, period. And yet we're supposed to believe them on other things. He looks like he's got something to hide. There may be nothing there, but why do they keep acting like there is?
John Avlon, we need to talk now about the very strange and tragic story of Seth Rich. Sometimes when I'm out in the real world, people ask me all the time, what is fake news? They're confused. What does it mean? This is Exhibit A of what a fake news story took hold, unfortunately, on FoxNews.com about the circumstances surrounding the murder of Seth Rich, DNC staffer. It turns out, fabricated, according to the primary source, a former D.C. homicide detective named Rod Wheeler, who was trying to look into the murder of Seth Rich. It turns out it was a botched burglary. He says that FoxNews.com fabricated quotes of his to make it appear as though there was that he was the leaker of the DNC emails, not Russia. Here is how the White House spun this yesterday.
The president had no knowledge of the story, and it's completely untrue that the White House involvement in the story. And beyond that, this is ongoing litigation, and I'd refer you to the actual parties involved, which aren't the White House.
Rod Wheeler, the person who was investigating this, says he did have a meeting at the White House. He did get emails saying the president's very interested in this story and how you're going to spend it.
Right, and those emails were sent to him, and texts were sent to him by a prominent Republican donor who Chris spoke to last night, who inserted himself in this. So what you've got, right? So you've got sort of a collusion between apparently Fox News, one of their contributors who's a private investigator, one of their reporters in a story that was subsequently deleted when it came under scrutiny, and a Republican donor who's got direct access to the White House, and saying that the president in these communications is directly involved in encouraging them to go forward. The reason this is so troubling isn't just the smearing of a dead GNC staffer's name and the attempt to deflect what is demonstrably true, that Russia influenced the election, which all our intelligence agencies agree, on the DNC and on this kid, right? It's also that we have seen the manipulation and intentional distortion of the term fake news to mean anything that the White House feels discomfort at confronting. But this is laid out in this lawsuit is a clear evidence of fake news, something totally concocted, totally for ideological and partisan reasons, fashioned out of whole cloth, that comes collapsing upon itself and is being coordinated with the White House. It cannot be said enough how outrageous this is. This has emails and texts that would appear to be a smoking gun. We'll see how it's litigated. But it really pulls the curtain back. And the fact that the curtain's being pulled back on the folks who are trying to say that independent journalism is fake news should infuriate everyone, let alone the family of Seth Rich and anyone involved in this larger investigation into Russia.
Crystal, let me tee up a piece of sound for you that Ed Butowski gave us last night here on CNN.
I never talked to anybody at the White House. By the way, I've never talked to President Trump in my life. And President Trump nor the White House has anything to do with any of this.
So he said in a voicemail to the detective something different. He said in a text something different.
That the president was
that the White House was involved, that the president had read it, that the White House was waiting for the article to come out. So it was all over the place. Now he's in denial mode, not unusual given the fact that there's a subject of litigation. But what is the point here?
Well, look, it's a pending lawsuit. This is Rod Wheeler, and Butowski's disagreeing. But this is, to John's point, what you are seeing here, sorry to sigh, but what you are seeing here is a coordinated effort to deflect and blame where there is not deflection and blame to go around. This is a murder, plain and simple. That's what the police have determined. And you're seeing it being twisted for political and partisan reasons. Even if it didn't come in the midst of a long-running and what I think to be fundamentally disingenuous attack on the idea of fake news. I put it in air quotes because that's not what it is. This is creation out of nothing and using the death of a kid. I mean, let's not forget that. Right. This is painful enough for Seth Rich's family, but now to say, well, really, he was a mole within the DNC leaking all this information. You know, I mean, I can't imagine losing a child, much less having him dragged through the mud in this way, where there is no real evidence here to suggest that that's the case.
David Gregory,
it's a bad look, broadly speaking, for the White House, and I think a absolute repudiation of this idea that somehow what we do on a daily basis is fake.
And yet another meeting that the White House official took, Sean Spicer in this case, that he didn't know anything about the meeting, and it only lasted 10 minutes and immediately turned from what this was about to their shirts.
David Gregory, we're out of time. We're so sorry. We owe you a response at some point.
This is outrageous.
On that
fake news.
On that note, we'll also we're going to have the family side coming up. Seth Rich's family spokesperson is going to be here with their response to all of these revelations. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Okay, the mooch, gone but not forgotten. Comedian Mario Cantone doing one final dead-on impression of the fired White House communications chief.
I just want to say I owe the American people nothing. But if they're going to get an explanation, because that's how I roll.
Now news from Venezuela. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says a special assembly will be convened soon with the power to rewrite the country's constitution and potentially target opposition leaders. President Trump warns Maduro that he holds the Venezuelan leader responsible for the safety of these two leading opposition figures who were taken from their homes in the middle of the night and thrown into a military prison. Venezuela's Supreme Court revoking the house arrest of those leaders, claiming they were, quote, planning to flee.
New questions about Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz's decision to employ an IT staffer under criminal investigation now. The complaint from an ethics group centers on why Imran Awan stayed on the payroll even though his privileges to work on the House of Representatives computer system had been revoked. Awan is facing a federal bank fraud count, arrested last week on his way to Pakistan. A spokesperson for Wasserman Schultz says he has been fired and called the complaint baseless.
All right, now for a lighter moment. Comedian Mario Cantone signing off as the Mooch, the star of Comedy Central's The President Show, channeling his inner Anthony Scaramucci one last time in this video for the New York Times. Watch.
I was a threat. The second I walked into the White House, my days were numbered. Look at me. I'm trim, I'm good looking, I dress sharp, I smell good. The Car Noir. You're going to want to lick me like a popsicle. I smell better than anybody on Trump's team. Those guys smelled like canned corn, and that's the first thing in the morning. And the women.
We are going to miss him. Cantone says he is not surprised Scaramucci only lasted 10 days in the White House. That's a sad byproduct of Scaramucci being shown the door.
The hope is that he shows up Thursday night. That's what, tomorrow night on the Comedy Central show. That would be good to see if Cantone is there again. Look, it's the first time, I guess, in our lives where we've seen that you don't have to exaggerate reality to create political comedy. Right. I don't know if that's funny or sad, but that's the reality right now.
Yeah, why does Mario Cantone have to go away? Like maybe Scaramucci can just have a cameo every week.
Yeah, like the ghost of.
Yes.
He lives on in spirit. All right, the Kremlin is retaliating against the United States. You're not hearing about this out of the White House. All right, we often look at the president's Twitter feed as a reflection of what he cares about most. And over the last week, he's weighed in on practically everyone and everything using that favorite platform. He blasted, let's take a look, blasted China. Very disappointed. Foolish past leaders allow them to make hundreds of billions of dollars a year in trade, yet they do nothing for us with North Korea, just talk. Harsh position by the president. Talked about the stock market, taking the positive. You can argue whether or not he deserves as much credit as he's giving himself, but he talked about it, and he talks about it a lot. And, of course, one of his favorite targets, at least in spirit, if not in number, is going after a free media. He takes the time to do that. So why are we pointing out what he talks about? To emphasize what he's not talking about. The Russians cut the American diplomatic staff by a crippling 755 people. Why? Retaliation, of course, for what's going on with them. What else is going on? Russia is back in Georgia. The last time they did this in 2008, hundreds of people died. Not a word about this or those Americans getting kicked out of Russia by the President of the United States on his favorite medium. Why? Well, what else are they doing? 100,000 troops on the border with NATO. Saber rattling, obviously. Again, not a word from the president. And it raises these questions. Why? Why hasn't he signed the sanctions bill that we're told that he will, against the advice of his own party, telling him to sign it now? And then there was this sound from the vice president.
In a further sign of our commitment, very soon, President Trump will sign legislation to strengthen and codify the United States sanctions against Russia.
And the president made it very clear that very soon he will sign the sanctions.
In a sign of our commitment, very soon, President Trump will sign legislation to strengthen and codify the United States sanctions against Russia.
Well, the vice president keeps saying that, yes, this is going to happen. No word from the president on when it will, and no signature. The bill is on his desk, awaiting signature. The White House press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, says it's in some sort of legal review. Given all these provocative actions from Russia, why the deafening silence? Let's discuss. We have CNN's military and diplomatic analyst, Admiral John Kirby. John, what do you see in this?
Well, you know, it could be something nefarious. It could be that he's really reticent for whatever reason to come out publicly against Putin. Or it could be that they are relying on the rest of the cabinet and the officials like Vice President Pence, like Secretary Tillerson, like Secretary Mattis, to sort of carry that language for him, to allow the president to sort of be the good cop while they're the bad cops, while they try to negotiate a better set of bilateral relations with Russia. It's hard to know. exactly what the reasoning is behind this, Chris. But I agree that it's troubling. I think it is concerning that our own president simply cannot and will not and has not, frankly, over the last 6 months, brought himself to directly criticize President Putin.
What is the material difference when you look at potential malefactors? Look how heavy-handed he is with China. He's much bolder. Look at North Korea. Very confrontational, all options on the table. Look at Venezuela. You know, there are big implications there to the economic actions that are being considered. You know, you cripple Venezuela's economy, you are 10% of their trade ratio when it comes to us sending heavy crude versus light crude and getting the medium mix back. And he's very bold there, but not with Putin.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, McMaster came out just the other day, I think it was yesterday, called Maduro a dictator. Very strong language. And with the exception of North Korea, which I do believe poses a very serious threat to their election meddling.
And to the point that you made that maybe the president is leaning on his seconds to do the work for him, here's what the Secretary of State said recently.
We do not seek a regime change. We do not seek the collapse of the regime. We do not seek an accelerated reunification of the peninsula. We do not seek an excuse to send our military north of the 38th parallel. And we're trying to convey to the North Koreans, we are not your enemy. We're not your threat, but you are presenting an unacceptable threat to us, and we have to respond. And we hope that at some point they will begin to understand that, and that we would like to sit and have a dialogue with them about the future.
So different from what we had been hearing from the president in terms of suggestion, and frankly, different than the previous administration also. What do you make of this pivot?
I thought Secretary Tillerson was pretty sharp yesterday, and you have to understand, Chris, when you listen to him say those words, he's not just talking to Pyongyang. He's talking to Beijing. He talked about something called peaceful pressure. You could see and hear in his voice he's trying to bring the rhetoric down. He's trying to take the militarism a little bit out of the language that we're talking about in North Korea. I think he's trying to take a little bit of air out of the president's tires on this, and rightfully so. The only thing the Chinese want less than a nuclear-armed North are millions of refugees streaming onto their territory because of a violently reunified Korean peninsula. And the only other thing they really don't want is American troops camped on the other side of the Yalu. So that's why he said what he said about not a violent reunification, not regime change. He was messaging Beijing because we are losing the diplomatic trade space with Beijing. The constant badgering, the tweeting, the threats of trade wars, none of that's going to work with President Xi. You need to convince President Xi that you understand his perspective here and their national security interests, and you're willing to try to find some diplomatic trade space. And I hope that that's what you were hearing out of Tillerson yesterday.
Well, it seems that that's what it is, and it's such an interesting contrast to the tough talk about how soft power was getting us nowhere. We had to take a different tack with North Korea. It seems Tillerson is squarely back in that space, hopefully for the better. We'll see how it plays out. John Kirby, appreciate your perspective, my friend.
You bet. Thank you.
Allison.
Okay, Chris, so there's this new lawsuit that accuses the White House of working in tandem with Fox News to concoct a fake news story about the murder of a DNC staffer. We hear from Seth Rich's family next.
Seeing the 1990s and
explosive claims in a new lawsuit accusing the White House, Fox News, and a Republican donor, Ed Butowski, of concocting a fake news story about the murder of DNC staffer Seth Rich. Butowski stands by the false report. Fox News retracted the story, as we now know.
Right.
Do you still believe there is something to the suggestion?
I don't believe there's anything in that story that isn't accurate.
You believe it's all
Fox
accurate?
News retract. Let me finish. I believe Rod Wheeler's saying that he was misquoted is the reason they pulled it.
All right, so CNN senior media correspondent and host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter, joins us now with more. Brian, wow, what a complicated and tragic story this is. Basically, Ed Butowski, not a journalist, hooks up with Rod Wheeler, former D.C. homicide cop, not a journalist, and together begin peddling this story that there's some connection between the murder of Seth Rich, a young DNC staffer, and WikiLeaks and the release of documents. And Ed Butowski admits that he's trying to, in emails to Fox and Friends and other Fox staffers, he's trying to distract from the idea that Russia was behind the leaks.
Trying to disprove all the Russia theories, trying to create a counter narrative. This is almost like a media literacy lesson for people. When you hear folks on Fox or other right-wing media outlets talking about something like the DNC and WikiLeaks, it's a counter narrative. It's designed to distract from the main issue at hand, the issue that federal investigators are looking into. But this, as you said, is a very sad story. It's the ultimate example of fake news, no matter how involved the Trump White House was or wasn't. And it's so sad because of this real-life family at the middle of what has, become this fictionalized and sensationalized story.
And that's the point. I mean, look, what connected Butowski and Wheeler? They're both Fox News contributors. And in terms of the lawsuit, we'll see how it plays out. Mr. Butowski says he has all this supporting documentation for his side.
And just to be clear, Rod Wheeler has now launched a lawsuit against Fox News because he says that they fabricated quotes of his.
Yes.
So he disavows the story now. He no longer.
Right. He says that they defamed him, so he's now suing his former employer. Right. There's these text messages, there's these voicemails, a lot of evidence that suggests unethical behavior at Fox. The Trump connections, I think, demand more reporting and more investigation. I was talking to Doug Wigdor, the lawyer in this case last night. He said, look, we're going to try to get into discovery. We're going to try to get emails. We're going to try to depose people and find out more about what connections there were to the Trump White House.
Look, and that remains to be seen. But what we know already for sure is that this family, 6 months into the worst kind of loss imaginable, one of their children, had this man Butowski come to them on a hunch from somebody to pull the scab off this situation. And they've been dealing with it ever since.
That's right.
Brian, thank you very much for all the background. We want to get right now to the spokesman for Seth Rich's family, Brad Bauman. Brad, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Brad, what did the family think when these revelations came to light about Rod Wheeler's lawsuit that he has now filed against Fox News, in which he claims that this story was crafted and concocted with the help of the White House?
Well, obviously, the family can't weigh in on the specifics of either the lawsuit nor the tete-a-tete that you guys had last night with Ed Butowski. But what I can tell you is that they have been utterly devastated this past year. That since Seth's passing last July, they have done nothing but try to maintain a sense of loss and to grieve the way that a family is meant to grieve, and that over and over again, because of conspiracy theories that have popped up, they have been deprived the opportunity to move forward. They've been deprived the opportunity to seek some new normal. And frankly, they feel like the police have been deprived of the ability to actually prosecute this crime.
And Brad, for people who did not follow this story closely, why does the family think that this conspiracy theory came to settle on Seth?
They don't know. And they don't ask for this. The truth is that all of these folks want is to find the murderer or murderers that did this. They didn't ask to be in the middle of the media spotlight, and they are perplexed by the fact that anybody would use the murder of their son, a wonderful mid-20-something-year-old kid who moved to Washington, D.C. in order to make a difference in this world, and who was gunned down senselessly in the streets of Washington. It's just ridiculous.
I have the affidavit here from the lawsuit that Rod Wheeler has filed, and he says that, he basically talks about what their motivation was, and that Ed Butowski, who was a Fox News contributor who hooked up with Rod Wheeler, sent an email to Fox producers and anchors telling them the narrative that he wanted to get out. I'll read a portion. One of the big conclusions we need to draw from this is that the Russians did not hack our computer systems and steal emails. And there was no collusion like Trump with the Russians. That was their bottom line, it sounds like, if you believe Rod Wheeler's lawsuit. What's your response?
Well, you know what strikes me? You had Ed Butowski on TV for about 20 minutes last night. And over the course of those 20 minutes, Ed Butowski had an opportunity to look the American people in the eye and the Seth Rich family in the eye and say, you know what? 6 months after I reached out to you, knowing what I know now, I cannot believe that I put you in this position. And I am so, so sorry. And he didn't even take that opportunity. He didn't even look the American people or the family in the eye to apologize to them and to say, I had no idea that I was going to heap so much more pain and anguish on you.
In fact, you heard what he told Chris last night in that exclusive interview, that he does stand by the story, despite the fact that FoxNews.com has retracted it, that Ed still believes it. He also, interestingly, seemed to want to plant the seed of suspicion against you. Let me play that moment and get your response. Listen to this.
They also said that this guy, Brad Bauman, just showed up one day and said he was assigned to them from the DNC. And they asked me, why?
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, not only was I not assigned to the family, and not only have I never in my life, in my career, ever taken a paycheck from the DNC, but I am a committed Democrat. And let's be clear, this is about something that is larger than partisanship. I think that anyone with a moral compass, Democrat or Republican, knows that one thing that you
feeling climate change's impact in every